The familiar tune of a Vote Common Good podcast. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Common Good Candidates podcast. This is where we have some conversations with some of the extraordinary, ordinary Americans who have climbed through the ropes and put themselves out there and are running for office. There are really amazing people up and down the ballot all across the country that are willing to serve and seek to represent us in a variety of positions. So no matter how excited or discouraged you might be about what's going on at the top of the ticket, there's lots of reasons to be excited about things that are happening down ballot. And today we're going to be talking with one of those candidates, a guy named Joel Levi, who is running in central Indiana. Joel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Hey, Joel, let's begin with the end in mind.
Yeah.
It's November 6th.
Yeah.
What have you accomplished? What are you proud of? How are you feeling?
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, the reality of the stakes of my election is that it would be unprecedented for Indiana. As a candidate living in Hamilton County, which is directly north of Indianapolis, this has been a county and a district that, like, the Democratic Party has had their eyes on for a long time now. And it would be pretty much like a David and Goliath type situation. Like, if I were to actually win this race, I think it would draw a lot of attention to Indiana, to the potential of the suburbs and what they offer for having this sort of critical or sort of conversation about politics, right? There's less identity politics in my district, a little bit more of just trying to weigh the extremism, trying to understand, can our politicians actually work for us, or are they just in their own self-interest? So it'd be a pretty big deal if I were to actually win come November 6th. And I would hope to use that momentum to really spotlight just Indiana and what it what its potential is, because a lot of people just view us as just like, oh yeah, blood red Indiana. Just like, I went to a conference in Michigan, I think it was about a month ago, and it was just being a part of like their Democratic Party up there, but they looked down at Indiana just like, oh, like, good for you, man. Like, sort of just like, that's cute that you're a Democrat running in Indiana. And so I think it would just really send some waves through the political sphere. So that's what would happen if I were to win
Yep.
November 6th. Yeah.
Now, you're a husband, father, musician, a
Yeah.
pharmacy technician. Um,
Yeah.
you want to add state senator to that resume. How did you come to decide to run for state senate?
Yes, great question. Because I think when people do look at my resume, it's very working class, very sort of blue collar. People just sort of assume that, like, oh, someone like me wouldn't run for office, which is fair to say. But the reality of my situation is that, to sort of just make it concise, for me, Donald Trump winning in 2016 was a big head turner, as it was, I think, for a lot of people. But when my wife and I moved back to Indiana, so we were originally born and raised in central Indiana, we moved back in 2020. I have a 5-year-old son. At the time, he was 2 when we moved back. But what really sort of got me energized and just sort of upset at like the situation that we're living in right now was the situation in Uvalde, Texas, and the shooting there, and seeing what I would always call like the closest thing to pure evil. And then you sort of continue on, and then later you see the shooting in Nashville, Tennessee, which my wife and I are very familiar with that area, and you continue to see the most vulnerable and most precious of our population being attacked, taken advantage of, without really any sort of party coalescing and trying to make a change. So why I'm running for state senate is because of where I live. So like I said, I live in the county directly north of Indianapolis. It's a pretty affluent county, but also a very purple county, and I live at the very northern end of that. So I think most people, when they run for office, would maybe run for town council or city council, something like that. So I live in Cicero. My wife and I and my 5-year-old son live in Cicero. It's a beautiful little lakeside town, but the entire town council is Republican, so really no avenues there. If you zoom out a little bit further, I actually live in the Speaker of the House's district, which I always joke like he sort of gerrymandered with the surgeon's knife. Basically, created a very unassailable district there. So then you zoom out a little bit further, and it's the state senate district, which is 20, and that encompasses Cicero, Noblesville, and then Carmel. And having several conversations with people and people that have viewed this race seems like could be the most competitive race where I live specifically. So the reality of my situation was like either run for state senate or stay home and keep yelling at my TV, just saying like, is somebody going to do something? So I sort of jumped in. So I just started, making the phone calls, reached out to the executive administrator of the Democratic senators, reached out to a recent senator that was elected in Indianapolis, Senator Hunley. She's sort of taken me under her wing. She's also younger. She's 41. I'm 36. So I think she could relate to my race and to me just trying to be a parent, trying to make their state a better place for their kids.
Yeah. So, I mean, what exactly does a state senator do?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about this race versus the House races, because I think what's interesting about a senator specific office is that they can actually initiate and have a lot of strength in sort of starting bills.
Hmm.
And I think that they have sort of this leg up in the sense of like having the two systems of like House versus Senate. They have a little bit more of weight behind the bills that they sort of sign and sort of put forth. And I think that that's something that is a little daunting to think about that kind of weight or responsibility, or you could say power given to me. Um, but it's something that I think would be unique in my story and maybe the story of Indiana or even really the story of this country. Not to sound too dramatic, but just like for
Hmm.
someone that doesn't have any other interests but, systemic change and wanting a better state for their children, like I'm not bought and paid for, I guess. Like I've always been self-conscious of not having a lot of money or coming from humble origins, but like I do think that it gives me a unique voice to the sense of like I'm not, like my opponent, like I'm not a CEO of a property development company. I have nothing really to gain financially from this other than trying to push the needle forward. I want a safer
Hmm.
Indiana. Like I want a more inclusive space where like the affordability crisis for housing is a really big issue right now. And it's like, that's it. Like that's why I'm running. And I would hope and pray that like that's a fresh voice and maybe a new perspective that Indiana needs.
Yeah. What's it like running for office? Like as a first-time candidate, has it been what you expected it to be? Like, I mean, we've all got like these visions, like of we watch
Right.
West Wing or we watch,
Yeah.
House of Cards, and you get like that.
Yeah.
Oh, there's all this intrigue and there's all this fast talking, and what's it actually like to run for office?
Yes. I always call running for office a battle between the head and the heart. And especially for me, coming from someone that doesn't come from a lot of money, is like I know in my heart I'm doing the right thing. I know that this is standing up and trying to make a difference and all of those like really good, like good feeling type things. But then when you really get in the weeds of it and just realize how much money is involved, it is staggering and overwhelming. And I would say that has been the biggest, just sort of something I knew in the part of my brain, but never so viscerally until going up against an opponent, that has $100,000, and I know that there are races that are bigger than that, but like when it comes to a working class candidate, like $100,000 to compete in a race is like pretty staggering.
Yeah.
And I just find myself realizing there's there's a legitimate reason why people like me don't run for office. And the
Mm.
biggest barrier to entry, I think, is money. Like the
Yes.
fact of how much money it takes really creates this barrier for people like everyday people like me to run for office. And I say this on both sides of the aisle. So I'm going to
Mhm.
be very candid. Like when I roll up to like Democratic meetings, other candidates in my district are rolling up in like a Tesla. I mean, like green car, like a Lightning, Ford F-150. They're all green cars, but like the other candidates are like one's a doctor, another one's a lawyer, another one is Vietnam vet, now an airline pilot. Like this is on both sides of the aisle. Like usually you walk into this scenario having an exact plan of how much money you can raise, and I chose that like I wasn't going to let that stop me. So I battle the head and the heart a lot running for
Yeah.
office.
Yeah, I know when I ran for Congress in 2018, if you had asked me at the beginning of my campaign, list your top 10 campaign issues,
Yeah.
campaign finance reform would not have been on the list. It
Right.
wasn't in my
Right.
top 10.
Right.
And by the time my campaign ended, if you had said list your top 10 issues, campaign finance reform would have been number one on the list.
Yeah.
Like, I think
Yeah.
people, I don't know if people have a sense of, you hear the
Right.
numbers thrown around and like, oh, it sounds like a lot of money. But
Right.
how staggering it is when you are up against uh, so much money. And I
Yeah.
think it's, you've seen those studies that are like, there's a certain income level at which, like, you don't get appreciable, am I saying this word correctly? You don't get more happy. You don't get happier, like, the more
Right.
money.
Right.
It's,
Diminishing returns. Yeah.
yes, there's a sense of like, okay, you got to hit a certain threshold to be
Yeah.
happy, but then
Hmm.
anything above, I think it's like making 70,000 a year or something like that. Um,
Hmm.
and I think there's the same thing with politics. It, like, there's there ought to be like a certain threshold that once you hit that, you can run a competitive race.
Hmm.
And but you've got to hit that threshold, right?
Right.
And when you're nowhere near it, or you're struggling to get there, or you can't self finance, or you don't have a Rolodex of millionaires to call on,
Yeah.
and you look at an opponent who's got a war chest,
Yeah.
it's like, it's really, it's tough.
Yeah. And it really just sort of makes you question just like the people that we have elected in office, like how much, of this sort of quid pro quo, like this financial, like backing for this, like how much of that really goes on. And I
Yeah.
know in Indiana, like it's pretty blatant, like it's not even really like that hidden. Um, but like you have, like an opponent that I'm going up against that like very directly financially benefits from being a state senator
Mm,
because he's also a property development, like CEO. So like the
yeah.
contracts that he's getting in like a police department in Carmel, which I love police departments, support the police, but like he has a direct advantage of getting that $15 million project over just, another contract on the street or like, so you see this sort of like, it's out in the open. Like this is common facts. Like there's actually articles like in our, Hamilton County Reporter talking about the state senator I'm running against, like directly, financially receiving from being a state
Wow.
senator. But sort of people just sort of like, I think they just sort of shrug their shoulders and just like, like, isn't that just sort of the way it is?
Mm,
And it's unfortunate because I think we
yeah.
have become sort of numb to this sort of people view candidates or, elected officials as just sort of like other, like a little bit of a stratosphere above the common person. And it sort of allows them to get away with a lot, as we definitely see on the national scale.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like, well, that's just politics, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well, we've been talking about some of the kind of discouraging, frustrating things about the system and campaigning
yeah,
and everything that comes up. Now, listen, I did not know this. I did a little bit of research. I did not know this. Sliced bread invented in Indianapolis. And I know you're a little north of Indianapolis, but
yeah,
when people talk about, oh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, we have your area of the country to thank for that. Tell us more about Central Indiana and what's great about it. What's something we ought to know, we ought to do. Tell us, you know, besides, rooting for the Colts or whatever. Like,
right.
what is? Tell us about Central Indiana.
Yeah, I feel like if I were to talk about Central Indiana, or maybe the Midwest at large, I feel like the Midwest, Indiana, is sort of like that girl in school that had the glasses on that was maybe dorky, sort of takes them off and like sort of like lets her hair fall down. And everyone's just like, oh, because we have climate change, we have cost of living happening on both coasts of this country, and suddenly now like to have like an actual affordable cost of living, a backyard, all this sort of things that like a lot of people want, like people are now looking at Central Indiana and just like, oh, so like it's not scorching hot and during the summers, you can afford a backyard, you have like pretty good schools, like, oh, okay, like maybe Indiana is actually sort of cool now, uh, as opposed to like living in like a DC or like a LA, or just like people are just getting priced out of the coast. So that's my little plug for like Midwest
Love
life
it.
right now. It's just like it's suddenly becoming cool, slash affordable. But I think the biggest thing we have going against us is like progressive ideas and inclusivity. And that's sort of the stereotype that I think my race and other races are trying to break, of just like Indiana isn't just this backward state of just like a bunch of, backwards thinking, or maybe possibly racist, or just like um, mindset. Like it actually is a pretty cool place to live, a lot going for it, but it's the narrative that we're trying to break, right?
Yep.
Um, because I think even like Michigan has, a lot of progressive ideas and like has a lot of stuff going for it. Even Illinois, Ohio, we probably lean a little bit more towards Ohio as far as just like the way that people brand us. But like I said before, like I live sort of like in a lakeside community, sort of directly north of Indianapolis, and it's really grown on my wife and I and our son. Like the biggest reason why we moved here was being close to family. So my wife's sister lives 6 houses down from us. They go to the same
Nice.
school. Like they're going to be going to kindergarten
Yeah.
together this fall. Like all that kind
That's
of like
awesome.
family, you know. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah. That wholesomeness when you think of like middle America, that's you got it. And as you're trying to change the narrative, may I suggest a slogan like Indiana, uh, the best thing since sliced bread. Yeah. Anyway, so okay,
yeah,
enough with the stupid jokes. So, we've seen a lot of Christian nationalism, which is
yeah,
something that at Vote Common Good we think about a lot and talk about a lot because
yeah,
we see it as a threat both to Christianity and to the United States of America. Um, we've seen a lot of Christian nationalism bubbling up in state houses, in state
yes.
legislatures. Is that happening in Indiana?
Yes, that's actually a pretty recent development that just happened in June. So Mike Braun won the Republican ticket for going into the fall, and had picked a lieutenant governor, sort of just handpicked for someone that he wanted. But there was another candidate and a pastor in Noblesville. He actually lives in my district, and is an outspoken Christian nationalist that sort of ran against Mike Braun's handpick, and sort of courted the delegates at the June Indiana GOP convention, and actually won by a pretty slim margin, about 40 delegate votes, and
Hmm.
basically sort of upended the status quo as far as the Republican Party ticket is concerned. Basically, just sort of directly marketing himself to the delegates and going around sort of conventional ideas. And a lot of people thought it was a long shot, but he did it. So it has a lot of those sort of similarities to like a Trump type run of just like everyone thought he couldn't do it, and now he's going to be on the ballot in the fall. But if I could say the first thing um, about Christian nationalism is that Christian nationalism isn't Christian. It actually goes directly against one of Jesus' foundational teachings on the Sermon on the Mount of loving your neighbor as yourself. And you cannot love your neighbor as yourself. I'm sure that no Christian nationalist would want to live in the United States where another religion was being taught in the schools and being forced to be on the walls of those schools. And it goes against the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. And that's the biggest thing that I want to be a voice for. And I want to be an outspoken critique of. It's like, I'm a Christian candidate, and Christian nationalism is not Christian. And I can't say that enough, because it uses Christianity by force rather than allowing religion to be in the public sphere where everyone can believe their own foundational beliefs without fear. I call it faith without fear. And what we're heading towards is a space in the public sphere where people that don't believe a Christian ideology fear for their own free opinion, their own free will. And it's just, I think it's an important narrative to have. And there are other voices. If I could give a quick plug to a friend of mine, Andrew Whitehead, a recent friend of mine who just wrote a book called American Idolatry. He actually is an associate professor of sociology in Indianapolis. And so he and I actually just got coffee a couple months ago to sort of talk about this, and like recently had a conversation for the Indianapolis Star that's going to be coming out like later this summer, just sort of talking about Christian nationalism, because it is, the idea isn't new, but the term is new for a lot of people. So we wanted to sort of shed light on what it is and what it represents, and then why I feel so adamant about speaking against it.
Yeah. And those of you that are either watching on YouTube or listening on one of the podcast platforms, you can find in the Vote Common Good stream, you can find conversations with Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who wrote a book. Is it
It was
Take
before
America Back
American
for
Idol.
God?
Yes, yes,
Yeah, Take America Back for God, which they're not advocating for, by the way.
yeah,
Yeah, but just really, really sharp minds, people
hmm
who are thinking about these things. Yeah, so I mean, it's really important for particularly Christians to
right,
stand up and say, "Hey, this co-opting of our faith for political purposes is not okay. It's not
right,
all right." And then not just critiquing it, but also providing an alternative way to engage as a faithful person in
hmm
our political system. Because there is, I think, there is a way to be involved in American politics, uh,
right,
motivated by trying to love your neighbor as yourself, motivated by the common good,
right.
without any desire to give preferential treatment, or
Mhm.
even worse, impose your own faith on others.
And I feel so, I guess compelled is the best word, because I think it speaks volumes. And I made this very clear in the interview for the Indie Star. Is just like, I am a Christian going against Christian nationalism. I think that our, or my voice specifically, or Christians' voices specifically, need to be heard, to know that like we could, in quotes, directly benefit from this kind of ideology, but we actually stand against it
Yeah.
because we believe it goes against freedom, it goes against democracy. Um, and I feel like it's very, un-American. I feel like, in my opinion, I can be a Christian, a patriot, and also speak against Christian nationalism. And we're seeing this sort of in real time right now, in Louisiana with like the Ten Commandments being put up in schools. Even more recently in Oklahoma with the state superintendent saying that like Bible must be taught in schools. It's like, this is not right. And I know that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to speak against this, but our voice, or my voice, like, I want to continue to say that, like, as me as a candidate, I think it's very important for me to say that this is not right on any level. And it's also, they are co-opting Christianity. Like, this is also not even Christian. So I want to be a voice for someone that has politics informed by faith, but only as a way of a mechanism of deepening my empathy and how can I love my neighbor as myself, whether that be safety, housing, or faith without fear.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Now, you mentioned early on that it was school shootings that, really kind of broke open your heart and kind of got you thinking about running for office. Um, what's your plan? Like, what can be done? Where do we start? What do we do about gun violence, and particularly gun violence in schools?
Yeah, I think the story of Indiana is really the story of the United States. Like Indiana has a unique position of, if I were elected into office come November 6th, the reality of my situation is I'm still going to be elected into a supermajority, where the Republicans dominate the state house, and the only path to any sort of systemic change is reaching across that aisle and trying to bring, I hope this doesn't sound cliche, but humanity back to politics, of
Hmm.
like the sense of like, there will be some very foundational things that I won't agree with another Republican candidate in the state house. But can I find that common ground of saying, like, from parent to parent, let's put a little bit of the identity politics aside and just like, do we want to protect the most vulnerable? Do we want to protect the most precious things in our life, which I think are our children? Can we agree on that? Can we sort of put aside the idea of like maybe who's lobbying against us to do the right thing? And I think that's my whole goal is to try to hone in on that. Um, because just a quick background on just like the gun situation in Indiana right now. Um, there's a lot of things that could be done to make the state safer, but I think the most obvious one is right now in the state of Indiana, you can have a criminal record, you can have a record of domestic violence, and still legally purchase a firearm from a private
Hmm.
seller.
Wow.
And what I feel like this does is it allows violence to lead to more violence. And so you see this sort of like systemic pathway of like, if you are doing something that is violent, you have a path to exacerbate that or make that worse or do something even more detrimental. So my
Hmm.
hope is that by closing this loophole, we can still have the Second Amendment right. I'm not trying to take away anyone's gun, but we can sort of close that loophole of like violence leading to more violence and to protecting our children.
Yeah.
And I hope that that can resonate. As I'm knocking doors, I have to sort of say this in like 10 seconds, right? Like, hi, I'm Joel. I'm running for office, just running for a safer Indiana to keep our children safe. But the reality is just like, I'm trying to stop a systemic path of violence. And if there's a way that we can do that and still have the Second Amendment, I hope that we
Hmm.
can find that common ground of like, I'm not taking anything from you. I'm just adding a layer of responsibility.
Yeah. 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 That's good. We ask voters to use the common good as their voting criteria when
Mhm.
they go uh, into the voting booth, and we ask candidates that are running for office to use the common good as their governing criteria. It's not about necessarily like agreeing on every policy position. It's not about a platform. It's much more a shared set of values. I'm curious, when you think about the common good, when you hear that phrase, what resonates with you? What does that mean to you? What's that look like for you?
I think vote common good, when I hear that idea, when it like sets in my heart, is like it's not partisan. It's not saying, oh, vote common good means vote Democrat. Or oh, hey, vote common good means vote Republican. It means look at each candidate and does it look like they have your best interest at heart? And I think we were talking about the sort of barrier to entry of just how much money it takes to like run for office. I think it's, can we find candidates or can I be a candidate that actually truly wants to be a public servant rather than a politician that has their own self-interest at heart? And I think that Vote Common Good is trying to understand that we have a really big identity politics that pulls us away from making common sense choices. We can see a candidate that we think maybe doesn't line up with our ideology, but because we grew up a certain party, we sort of turn off that critical thinking in our brain. We sort of choose to be like, well, that doesn't feel right. They don't really seem to be doing the right thing, or maybe they don't even care about me, but I've historically voted this way, so I'll continue to do it anyways. I think vote common good is just like, can I break down that internal structure, that internal sort of tribalism, and be like, what candidate has a good heart and
Yeah.
I feel like is doing the right thing to make a better state or a better America?
Yeah, trying to get people's voting patterns off of autopilot,
Yes.
and
Yes.
being very intentional about it. Joel, how do you, I mean, when you're involved in this, I mean, all of us that aren't running for office kind of feel the onslaught of negativity. And then I imagine as a candidate, like you get it even more. How do you stay positive in the midst of it? How do you keep going?
That's a great question. I sort of have to take a
Maybe
deep
you
breath.
don't.
Yeah. I think that this is something that I've sort of come back to as just sort of a refrain. And it's just really sat with me as a candidate. It's just the idea of like the serenity prayer, trying to understand, peace for the things that I can't control, courage for the things that I can. And then the third part is wisdom to know the difference. Because, on a broad, if you zoom out a lot, I mean, I can really get in a dark place when I think about the issue at the border right now of just like human lives that are precious, made in the image of God, that want a better life for themselves and are struggling to find safety and security. And there are times where it can really work me up into a frenzy where it's just like, I feel like I'm about to come out of my skin. And then I sort of have to sort of say the serenity prayer of just like,
Hmm.
like I can't affect that right now. I can still feel that, but I can't affect that right now. I have to have a certain level of peace. It doesn't mean disconnecting, but at least a layer of peace. And then I focus on my specific race. Okay, what can I have the courage to change in Central Indiana, in District 20, in Cicero? How can I make this a more inclusive, a more welcoming place, a safer place? That's the courage. And then the third part is that wisdom of just like, how can I be discerning and know what I
Yeah.
can and can't change and just try to find a center?
Yeah.
So that's,
Hmm. Hmm. How can people find you? How can people help? What do you need? How can people connect?
yeah. As a, maybe the term is for a recovering Christian or as a Christian, being a 36-year-old, I say this cliche line, I do appreciate prayers. I know
Hmm.
that's a very cliche thing to say. We've all grown up with it. Any sort of prayers would be greatly welcomed. But if you felt inclined to donate to the campaign, obviously I would take that. I think that's my campaign is essentially grassroots. Don't really have any major, corporate contributors, but you could go to joelleviforindiana.com. You could donate there at my Act Blue page. But yeah, I think, and thirdly, I think it's just like getting to know your down ballot candidates.
Hmm.
That's sort of like my uphill battle of just trying to let people know that like you may feel disenfranchised by the top of the ticket and the age gap and whatever that may be, but like there are local candidates in your area trying to make your state and your area a better place. That's what I'm trying to do for Central Indiana and for District 20. So yeah, if you feel inclined, even if you live out of state and you reverberate with my message, feel free to go give online. $5, $10 is great. But yeah, that's a way that you can help my campaign.
Yeah. Joel, as you know, through my work with Vote Common Good, I talk with a ton of candidates for office around the country.
Yeah.
And you were one of my faves. Your your heart and your willingness to jump into this motivated with all of the best intentions. I just uh yeah, I'm so happy that you're running, and thank you for being on the podcast today. Thank you for sharing your story and your campaign with all of us, and I encourage folks to get out there and support Joel.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Hey, thanks everybody for listening in on this conversation with Joel Levi, candidate for the state senate in Indiana, District 20. Conversations like this are happening every Wednesday between now and election day, right here on the Vote Common Good podcast network. Is that a thing? Do we have a podcast network? Uh, you can learn more about Joel and all of our other candidates for Common Good by visiting candidatesforcommongood.com. We'll